Welcome back. This is the first tutorial of 12 in total where I will discuss with you the archetypal profiles of the Devious Dozen, where together we will both explore the 12 characteristic traits that can lead to self-abusive and self-sabotaging behaviours. And today, in this tutorial, we will explore the archetype called the Fantasist. Who is the Fantasist? The Fantasist is the part of you, the strong desire that you have for pleasure, indulgence, and reverie. The superpower of the Fantasist is instant gratification, which means this archetypal trait is our drive for experiencing those desires which are deeply satisfying, stimulating, comforting, and enjoyable. The Fantasist has a motto, and that is, arouse me and I'm yours. That's because anyone or anything that excites you will trigger the desires of the Fantasist within you. The Fantasist within you is primed with a drive to seek out gratification. That's the name of its game. So how do you know when you are being the Fantasist? The Fantasist is a part of the self, an archetype that imagines the things that you desire. You are being the Fantasist when imagining and yearning for the things that you like to indulge with, that's going to bring you ultimate pleasure. Now, the fantasy itself can be reality-based, where you desire after that which can be achieved in the real world, and therefore the Fantasist part of you is the catalyst, the drive, the preview of your imagined desires, where you are fantasizing about having that something and then taking action towards it. Or the fantasy can be non-reality based, where you fantasize about something which is highly improbable. It really is just a fantasy inside the head and nothing more. And those non-reality based type of fantasies that are never acted out are usually inappropriate, unusual, dark, or unrealistic. Therefore, they are fantasies that remain inside the mind. So just to recap, we have fantasies that remain inside the mind and those that we actually act upon in the real world. So, when are you becoming the Fantasist? When your life has become too mundane, uneventful, unappealing, and discomforting, that's typically when you start to fantasize about doing something that's rewarding, pleasurable, comforting, and better. The Fantasist will always be the precursor to that pleasurable activity that you like doing, where the Fantasist will have a preview of the forthcoming experience, this preview inside the mind where you experience what I refer to as the pre-reward memory, which means that you imagine how good the object of your desire will be before you actually try to obtain it. The pre-reward memory itself is what triggers this sensory stimulus within. We can feel the buzz of the pleasure, that exciting anticipation that we always feel just before the pleasure actually arrives, which triggers that strong impulsive urge, this flight of fancy towards the thing that we desire. Once you have been triggered into action by the fantasies, there's no stopping you. In that moment, you're being swept away by your strong emotions towards doing or getting that thing that you know will pleasure you. These pre-sensations, if you will, they feel so intense because they come with a surge, this hit of the feel-good biochemical called dopamine. Dopamine is a biochemical that's released from the brain's neurotransmitters. Dopamine is a natural biochemical sensation that elicits a reward, motivational impulse towards the activities that we know will give us the pleasure that we fantasize about. Now let's discuss the different types of fantasies. I've placed these into 5 different categories. We have sexual fantasies, pleasure-based fantasies, ideal fantasies, speculative fantasies, and non-reality fantasies. Let's start with sexual fantasies. We all have sexual drives, needs, and urges that we would like satisfied. Sex is the principal drive of the human experience. Therefore, it is a normal and natural desire to want sex. We are all subjects of sexual attraction, and we all have the desire to engage with a sexual act with someone that we love, a partner, or even a stranger. It is during a sexual fantasy that we imagine an intimate and intense scenario of having sex that feels sexually arousing, and this triggers us to instigate sex with someone, or this drive, this desire can lead to the self-pleasuring act of masturbation. Now, sexual fantasies can be beneficial or detrimental. So let's first explore how they are a beneficial asset. First off, sexual fantasies are a pleasurable, enjoyable, and arousing experience. It feels nice. Having sexual fantasies should be considered as a sign that you have a healthy sexual libido and that everything about you is functioning in a healthy and natural way. Also, when we share a sexual fantasy with a trusted partner, this can actually strengthen and deepen the bond and intimacy, keeping that passionate flame alive. Because after all, as a partner within an intimate relationship, we want to feel attractive and we want to know that our partner desires intimacy with us. So sharing sexual fantasies is a great way to do this. It keeps the sexual tension of the relationship alive. Sexual tension with a partner links excitement and anticipation to that relationship. When without an intimate partner, having sexual fantasies will actually cultivate a strong desire to approach people that you're sexually attracted to. Think of sexual fantasies as being these mental rehearsals that prime you emotionally to seek out intimate relationships. It's that drive, that yearning, that hunger to have sex which initiates us to seek out and approach potential sexual partners. Which now brings me on to the detrimental impact of sexual fantasies. Sexual fantasies don't always get pursued in real life because they're somewhat inappropriate and improbable. Sexual fantasies can be dark and sordid. So this could be to imagine having dirty sex, group sex, orgy sex, swapping partner sex, rough sex, violent sex, taboo sex, having sex in public places, being watched whilst having sex or watching others having sexual encounters. We may even fantasize that our partner will cheat on us. So why do we have dark sexual fantasies? Well, let me preface this by saying that these are part of the yin and yang way of life. Wherever there is light, there is dark. Darkness does not mean that there is something wrong. It just means that someone likes or someone is drawn to the dark side of something. With dark sexual fantasies, we are looking for drama, excitement, and the thrill of doing something dangerous. Dark sexual fantasies, however, will desecrate the sacred act of two people having sensual and respectful communions with each other. If we follow through with dark sexual fantasies by introducing sordid elements into a sexual relationship, then we violate the sacred matrimony of sex. We are turning a divine act into a somewhat dirty deed, where the sexual act has become animalistic and perverse, where the human body itself has become nothing more than a sexual instrument. When having sexual fantasies about other people whilst in a relationship, so this could be imagining sex with the next door neighbour, a work colleague, a friend, a friend's partner, or even a pornographic actor that you are watching on a screen, although the imagined fantasy may seem harmless, inside the mind, you're still being unfaithful to the person that you're having a relationship with. So you've got to then question, why am I seeking to be aroused by someone outside of the relationship? Why is the relationship itself not fulfilling my sexual needs? Moving on, and this is especially for men. Sexual fantasies can lead to over-masturbation and porno addiction. The problem with this is when directing sexual energy into acts of self-pleasuring and using artificial stimulation for the aid of arousal, we are then less motivated to pursue sexual encounters in real life, which in effect takes us away from the very thing that we actually desire, sexual relations with a real person. Pornographic movies in particular often portray sex as being this aggressive and seedy act of animalistic lust. If therefore watching explicit sex acts on the screen by professional sex workers, we are likely to form a lopsided and disproportionate viewpoint towards the act of sex, where we can unknowingly form a lack of respect towards the other sex, forming these perverse expectations of how we want the other to perform. Essentially, with perverse adult movies, we are feeding and cultivating a seedy and dark fantasy. When being overstimulated by sexual fantasies, we are likely to engage with promiscuous behaviour. That's because what we continually feed grows in size. If you feed the sexual element of the fantasist, you will build its lustful desires for pleasure. Promiscuity itself is the gateway to demoralisation and self-contempt, where there is a risk of gaining a bad reputation among peers and alienation from those who disapprove, with the danger of developing STDs, sexually transmitted diseases. Let me now finish this by saying, whilst anything is fair game with consenting adults, dark sexual fantasies are a desecration of what should be a divine and sacred ritual. There's also emotional complexities and backlash that stems from engaging with sordid acts. Also, sexual energy itself is a powerful force of creativity that can be harnessed for creative works. And yet, when exhausted through regular sexual gratification, ejaculation and relief, we lose the vital power of its impetus and drive. This now brings me on to the pleasure-based fantasy. Pleasure-based fantasies are when we tend to fantasize over our favourite comfort and treat foods. We can fantasize over the pain-soothing and pleasure-giving effects of alcohol beverages, illicit and prescriptive drugs. We can also fantasize over the rewarding experiences of activities like gambling and gaming, and even interacting on social media. Wherever we are getting pleasurable stimulation mentally, emotionally and physically, then we are attracted to it, we are fantasizing about it. Now, pleasure, of course, can be a beneficial asset. Having pleasure is a normal and a good part of the human experience. A little bit of pleasurable indulgence every once in a while, and within moderation, is both harmless and essential to living a balanced life, as long as the risk has been rationalized to account for the dangers and side effects. For wherever there is pleasurable upside, it comes with a painful downside. Painful downside is both the short-term and long-term consequences. Pleasure-based fantasies are also part of the future reward mechanism. We can utilize the anticipation of a pleasurable reward sometime in the future to justify and compensate for the efforts that we must endure to get through the work, the hardships and the repetitions of everyday life. You sometimes need to know that there is some type of pleasure that makes the effort worthwhile, and fantasizing over that future indulgence is what sometimes helps us to get through the day and night. But too much of a good thing will have a detrimental impact. When immediate gratification outweighs delayed gratification, which means we indulge with pleasure in an imbalanced way more often than not, we can then form an imbalanced relationship with pleasurable substances. We can overindulge and reward ourselves often and for nothing. Over gratification then leads to complacency. There is less energy, initiative and motivation towards that which is different, effortful and demanding. Over rewarding with pleasure will take one down the path of diminishing returns. This means what you abuse, you lose. When pleasure is overused, we become desensitized to it. Here, the pleasure itself has become less pleasurable and less rewarding. With substances that have a toxic and acidic element, the overindulgence will prematurely degrade one's mental and physical health, leading to dis-ease within the mind-body. Now, if you were to take an audit of your life, you would probably realize that you do have a lopsided relationship with pleasurable stimulation and substances. Now let's move on to the third type of fantasy, ideals fantasy. We all fantasize about the ideal type of life that we would like to live. Ideals are important to have. The journey of life is about making progress from the unideal to ideal circumstances. The aim is to get better and more refined over time. By fantasizing over future potentials and better standards of living, this makes life worth striving for. Without striving for the ideal, we are usually stressing about the unideal. When done in a beneficial way and we strive towards positive outcomes, the fantasist trait does motivate us to cultivate the type of life that we idealize. You know, those ideals of a perfect relationship, the home, the car, the holidays, the career and the finances and whatever it is that you would ideally like. Fantasizing over what we would like to achieve will bolster creativity and the impetus to take action to manifest the tangible results. We must go there in the mind first before we can go there in reality. Without the vision of an ideal future, we have no clear-cut purpose nor direction. Therefore, fantasizing after the ideal type of life can be a good thing. However, the good is not without the bad. The fantasist's major downfall is to romanticize about the upside of a future ideal with little consideration for its downside. So we are fantasizing over the final destination. We are conjuring up these fairy tale fantasies which are based upon the once upon in a lifetime and happily ever after scenarios, which of course feels good, and yet when blindsided with nothing else but the rewarding element of what we fantasize about, when yearning after the final fantasy without considering the process of achieving that fantasy, then we are setting ourselves up for the fall. The fantasist is the part of you that will imagine scenarios whilst disregarding the efforts, the difficulties, the drawbacks, the sacrifices and the costs that come with pursuing one's desires in the real world. When chasing after ideals without the proper due diligence, the the fantasist trait can easily lead one into unforeseen complications, the mistakes and the failures, which leads to immense suffering and loss. That's because the fantasist rarely considers the reality of what you desire. And if we act on a fantasy without considering the reality counterpart, then we embark on an ill-conceived ideal that can manifest into the painstaking unideal. And when we are pained enough times, that's when we can form this negative association with certain desires, which then acts as a deterrent. We can then start to have dark fantasies that something bad and devastating will happen, which can then cause us to withdraw from life. The fantasist can also be a departure from one's true nature. When totally fixated on external pursuits that are superficial, the fantasist is likely to cultivate ideals that may seem appealing at first, but soon leaves one feeling discontent because they don't resonate deep within. Where one is pursuing these fantasies that have no real lasting meaning. They are just desire-based fantasies over the pleasure of having something. They do not provide the fulfillment. Also, the fantasist can yearn after fame, fortune and status to a point that one feels pained and unworthy to be without these things. So with the fantasist, what we have is a disproportionate relationship with reality. We are imagining how good things will be inside the head, and we're not taking into account what it actually takes to manifest those images in the real world and what's involved. Now for the fourth type of fantasy, which is the speculative fantasy. With a speculative fantasy, we are fantasizing about something that could happen in the future. So if it hasn't quite happened, we're fantasizing about something that could happen in the future. The problem with fantasizing that something may change and something may get better in the future is that we will find a reason to stay within circumstances today which might be discomforting or harmful. Here is the beneficial asset of a speculative fantasy. Sometimes actual reality can be a journey fraught with adversity and difficulty, and we can often find ourselves in unideal circumstances that are painful, disappointing and depressive. Therefore, the fantasy of a better future will elicit a sense of hope that things will change and improve. The fantasist archetype therefore can help us to visualize better times. Even without evidence to support that fantasy, just the imagination alone of what could happen in the future is enough to elicit the self-encouragement and desire needed to persist through the trials and tribulations of today as we make progress towards that which we fantasize as being better. Speculative fantasies, however, are delusional because they have no basis in actual reality. With speculative fantasies, the fantasist is projecting your mind into the future to imagine how life could potentially be, and this does not mean that the future will actually turn out this way. When fooling ourselves into believing that something will be much better than it actually is, this can lead to a sense of disappointment and failure even when what we imagined does not arrive as expected. In fact, almost always the manifested reality is never the same as the fantasy. Quite often the fantasy is much better because it does not come with the hardships and problems of manifestation. The biggest problem with speculative fantasies is when we start to imagine that a bad scenario today will somehow be better in the future. We then rationalize why we should continue putting up with that bad scenario today. For example, It's the person that is suffering some type of verbal or physical abuse from someone they know. They start to convince themselves that the person will change their ways in the future. They start to imagine that things will get better, and yet they don't, and the suffering continues. We can speculate with fantasy that someone would be much better off with us, and this could cause us to suffocate the relationship with control, which leads to conflict and resentment. We can also speculate with fantasy that someone would be much better off without us, where we start to say and do things unconsciously that sabotage the relationship. We can see people behave badly with someone else and then fantasize that they will somehow be different with us. We can see someone achieve something that we desire and then buy into an imagined fantasy that we can do the same thing when in reality we can't. So, with speculative fantasies, one has to be careful of what they speculate. There's nothing wrong with wanting something to be better, as this provides hope, or there's nothing wrong with imagining it will be worse, as this provides caution. Yet, one must also have their foot firmly grounded in the actual reality of what's going on now. Now let's discuss non-reality fantasies. The fantasist is a sucker for non-reality based activities that stoke the flames of imagination. We are having and feeding non-reality based fantasies by getting deeply involved with virtual reality, where cartoon animations, CGI, sci-fi productions, computer games, and social media apps have become a prominent theme in our life. Now, non-reality based fantasies have a place in the world. All inventions begin within the sphere of imagination. All digital devices are a platform to express and display that imagination. Fantasizing over how things can be improved is what sparks the creative impetus to manifest something different and better. Pushing the boundaries of what is known and possible is how we make the impossible become possible, how we make the unreal appear real. Some of the greatest inventions have begun as fictional ideas that at first seemed impossible to create. However, non-reality based fantasies have a detrimental impact, where childhood imaginations often develop into adulthood fantasies, where we have constructed this imaginary world inside the head that has no foundation and function within the real world. People can become so enthralled within their own fantasies that they actually prefer the fantasy more than the real experience of life, which is harmless unless you spend more time within that imagined scenario than cultivating a life in actual reality. When taking frequent flights of fancy into a digital reality, in comparison, this will make actual reality look dull and uneventful, whereby reality itself becomes this unsatisfying and intolerable place. The digital world is a form of escaping reality, where people are often getting relief from actual reality by losing themselves inside the fantasy of a virtual reality. When having one's fantasies being pacified by digital stimulation, one is trading the creative potential of their organic imagination for the pre-recorded imagery of other people's imaginations. There is also the high risk of developing a digital psychosis, a mental disorder, where the mind has been hijacked by the virtual world. The thoughts and emotions are impaired and disconnected from actual reality. The keen eye for that which stimulates imagination the fantasist archetype is likely to become a slave to the virtual illusions of a digital world, potentially wasting time on virtual activities that have no practical use and value in the real world, where there is less interest and inclination to participate in the real world, less impetus to pursue real life experiences and cultivate skills that are rewarded in society. So let's summarize the fantasist archetype. When directed towards beneficial means, the fantasist is a motivational asset of desires which are needed for a progressive life journey that manifests the ideal reality. To fantasize over something better will stir the emotions up to achieve it. When unchained and unchecked, the pleasurable imaginations of the fantasist become a super highway towards our dirty, naughty, sinful and indulgent habits, whereby the fantasist trait can easily sink you into the depraved repetitions of overconsumption and overstimulation, where you cultivate bad habits that lead to the negative consequences of stress in the various areas of your life. The fantasist characteristic trait can be so strong that you often get lost within a mental fantasy land. When preoccupied with a fantasy world inside the head, one is not living within the present moment of reality, the only thing that's actually real. The fantasist can also start to obsess over one particular scenario and start to neglect other areas of your life. People that live within the imagined world of fantasy do struggle to resonate with and cope with the everyday mundaneness of actual reality. They can start to box themselves off inside the fantasy and start to feel estranged, isolated and lonely within the private little world that they've created inside their head. When fantasies are not directed towards creative and positive means, they will lead down a pathway of destructive and degenerative means, which is aided and abetted by a society that feeds the mind with temptations and sins. Where the inappropriate and shameful fantasies are concerned, these can lead to the negative emotions of guilt, embarrassment, insecurity, weakness, and even anger. Dark fantasies in particular will always lead to detrimental outcomes that will degrade and defile our experience. We can also feel odd, disturbed, and disgusted by some of the fantasies that we're having. We can start to feel wrong or doubtful about what we are imagining and start to question our own morality and decency. If so, we need to question the appropriateness and origins of these fantasies. From the ancestral perspective, we could have certain types of fantasies that are encoded within our ancestral genes. From a cultural perspective, the fantasies that we have personalized and think originate from within could actually be images and desires that have been implanted into our mind by societal conditioning, where we have fantasies that have been conditioned into the mind by media-driven marketing, social and digital programming. From a spiritual perspective, it may be that you are receiving, downloading a fantasy telepathically from the collective field of consciousness. That's because the mind is just like the receiver of a digital device. It picks up and decodes the electromagnetic waveform that is transmitted through the ether, just like Wi-Fi, which means that you could be having fantasies that do not originate from within you. And I'll leave it for you to contemplate that. So now that you are familiarized with the characteristic profile of the fantasist archetype, I want you to give some thought towards where the fantasist shows up in your life. What type of fantasies are you having? Are they having a beneficial or detrimental impact on your life? You may want to watch this tutorial again, just to make sure that the information that I shared with you about the fantasist archetype is embedded into your mind and begins to make more sense for you. Now you are ready to move on to the second archetypal profile, and that is the archetype of the escape artist.